My name is Dan Niebrig. I'm the Executive Assistant to our Center Director, and on his behalf, I would like to welcome you to the third in a series of 20th anniversary of Apollo lectures and discussions that we've been having. The first two dealt with what we knew about the moon before Apollo, and then yesterday with the technical planning for the Apollo missions. Today's sessions cover an aspect of our work here that is unique to the Johnson Space Center, that of mission control, and more importantly, about the planning for the operation of those missions that are so essential to the success of the missions. Each of our panelists today is eminently qualified to discuss the topics because they have all served as flight directors or mission controllers during the Apollo program. Now, of course, later in their life, they went on to other ancillary positions like center director and program manager and a few unimportant jobs like that, but I'm sure they would all consider their time in mission control to be among the highlights of their career. Our moderator today is also eminently qualified for this subject. Dr. Joe Allen received his PhD from Yale University and in 1967 was selected as a NASA astronaut. Joe was on the support crew for Apollo 15, where he served as the mission scientist. He was Capcom for STS-1 and then flew as a mission specialist on STS-5 and 51A. So he has qualifications from both the ground and flight to serve on this panel. I'm sure you've all seen pictures of Joe tooling around in space in his jaunty EMU rescuing distressed satellites as we did on 51A. He is currently the president of Space Industries Incorporated here in Houston, so please welcome Dr. Joe Allen.
Dan, thank you very much, and welcome everyone. I'm pleased to be the moderator today. Every group of flight directors needs moderation, and I've been given that assignment, and I welcome it. I appreciate it very much. As Dan said, I was at NASA here at the Johnson Space Center for a number of years, and I think my main qualification to serve as referee today is the fact that I was also privileged to work in the mission control for a number of years. It's a very interesting, demanding, and more often than not, an enjoyable assignment. I worked for these gentlemen on the panel who were chief flight directors during the Apollo years, and their assignment for today over the next couple of hours or so is to recollect, and I quote the instructions given to us, recollect important aspects of the missions themselves. They're eminently qualified to do that, and if they don't remember the important things, I guarantee they'll remember some of the intriguing things, and I hope some of the amusing things that occurred from the perspective of the flight directors during the Apollo missions. We're gathered really to observe these missions and to celebrate the remarkable success of them. The main intent of today's panel is to celebrate and to enjoy. And to that end, if you are curious about one or two things they don't quite explain, please hold up your hand. And starting very early, I think we'll begin with questions from the audience. And I know if you don't have questions, there are numbers of things I've wondered about that I will begin to ask about. My panel members are starting here, Dr. Glenn Lunny. Glenn is from Pennsylvania, from Old Forge, Pennsylvania. He comes to the space business by way of the University of Scranton in Detroit. Glenn began not with NASA, but with NACA, the predecessor of NASA, in, believe it or not, 1958. He was with the Space Task Group from 1959 to 62. He came here as one of the original founders of the Manned Spacecraft Center in 1962. He was the chief of the flight directors during many of the Apollo missions and through the Apollo years. He went on to serve in many other capacities at NASA, and he is now the head of the Rockwell International operations here in Houston, Texas. On Glenn's right is Cliff Charlesworth from, I'm told, originally Minnesota. I don't quite believe it, but only briefly probably. Spent really much time in Mississippi. Came to the Manned Spacecraft Center also in 1962. Prior to that, he had been with the Army at KSC, and it was Canaveral then, or what?
Canaveral.
Okay. I don't remember back that far. Cliff was a flight director here 1962 through 1970, and also since that time had many other duties, including the assignment of deputy director of the then Johnson Space Center, and he retired from JSC last year. Next to Cliff, Jerry Griffin. Oh, no, it's Jerry, yeah. From Athens, Texas. Jerry went from Athens and spent an enormous amount of time at Texas A&M. I think he's still receiving remedial instruction from there. Was a flight director beginning with Gemini 11, having come to JSC in '64, and then worked most of the Apollo missions, if not, well, I think probably all. He was the lead flight director on 12, 15, and 17. He went on to many other assignments since that time, including the director of the Johnson Space Center, and he's currently with a headhunting firm here in Houston, Texas. Not yet successful. He's not found gainful employment for me as yet. Final panelist, Steve Bales. Believe me, Steve is the youngest of the group. He was 20 years younger when Apollo landed, weren't we all? But Steve was in his early 20s at that time. He's originally from Iowa. Went to school in Iowa. Came here immediately thereafter, I guess in '64, was a flight controller during Apollo, known as Guido. So it was years before I knew his name actually was Bales. He's now the Assistant Director, Program Support in the Missions Operations Directorate. And with that, I'll turn back to Glenn, who was the lead flight director on Apollo 7 that really got the Apollo mission started. Glenn.
Thank you, Joe. I've been asked to start with Apollo 7 because it was the first manned flight that we flew with the Apollo spacecraft. But perhaps more general than that, I would talk about it in terms of the events that led up to Apollo 7. I think in the minds of everybody here, up through and including Apollo 7, we were Earth orbit people. We were figuring out how to fly a spacecraft. And I think starting after Apollo 7 with the very dramatic Apollo 8 that Cliff will tell us about, we began the assault on the moon. Leading up to Apollo 7, we had a number of things happen in the program that were planned that don't get much attention and haven't been talked about much in these events. They were a series of unmanned shots that we had. We started off with a set of boilerplate vehicles out in White Sands, out in the desert, where we shot up solid rockets to about 30,000 feet, and then we blew them up and separated the command module and tested the escape system. We probably had half a dozen shots out there in the desert. Some worked, and some, by the way, were spooky as the devil, because some of them wanted to come back over the team that was launching them because of the winds. So it was kind of an exciting time, and we learned something about the Apollo escape system and how it was going to work and how, indeed, we could trust it. We never actually had to use it in a manned flight, but the Apollo escape system was very reliable and proven by those tests. We had a series of unmanned flights called 201 and 202, which were on the Saturn 1B, which was the smaller Saturn rocket used for Earth orbital flights and used on Apollo 7. Those flights were designed to test the heat shield. There was a lot we didn't know about the aerodynamics and the heating that would go with a return for the moon, and we exercised those parameters on a couple of flights that we called 201 and 202 in the mid-60s. And we had a lot of fun with those because they were unmanned and we had a lot of things to do from the control center. Later on, we flew the Saturn twice unmanned, Apollo 501 and 502. They also were very exciting flights. And the first one went by the book. That was the one I had. The next one that Cliff had almost came unglued a couple of times, and it was kind of a scary flight, and I'm sure you'll hear more about that during the course of the day. Before I then moved on to Apollo 7, I would say one more thing that I think is important about the team and the way we got to the moon. We had about 10 or a dozen Gemini flights, manned flights, 2 people in the cockpit. And when I look back on that, I think what I realize is that the people who planned the Gemini program in between the one-man Mercury capsule and the Apollo mission, where we had to do so much other kind of work going to the moon, it really was a stroke of genius, because out of that program came not so much space hardware. We used different hardware for Apollo. But what came out of it was the operations team. If you look at the astronauts that flew the Apollo missions, I think to a man, almost to a man, they had all flown in Gemini. We did launches, rendezvous. We didn't use the ejection seats in one very hairy sequence on the pad. We did rendezvous every way there was to do it. We did EVAs. We docked with the Genas. We rode around on chairs, or at least we tried to, the man-maneuvering chairs that we use a derivative of on the shuttle today. When I look back on that and realize all the different things that we did that were necessary to know how to do when we went to the moon, I would say that we came into Apollo with the flight crews and the ground crews like gangbusters. It's the word that occurs to me. We came into the Apollo program with a set of people who had done almost everything you could do in manned Earth orbital flight, and frankly, we were cocky. We thought we know how to do this stuff, and we were looking forward in this assault to the moon. The events had a tragic and well-known halt with the Apollo fire, and in the 18 or so months that intervened between that fire and the first manned flight of Apollo 7, a great number of changes were made to the spacecraft, and again, the program came out of it much stronger than it otherwise would have been in the race to the moon. To finish up this scenario then, as in extending our abilities to operate in Earth orbit, we had to know that the command service module, which was kind of the mothership for the Apollo missions, worked. Apollo 7 was flown in October, the fall of 1968, with only one more year to go to meet the President's deadline. It was about a 10-day flight in Earth orbit. We did everything we knew how to do to the command service module with the 3 astronauts and the ground people to test it. And out of that flight came eventually the plans for Apollo 8. Actually, a little before the flight, we decided we would do Apollo 8, which was the Frank Borman trip around the moon on Christmas. But when I look back on it, I see that all of those events of the unmanned Apollo flights, the things that we did in Gemini, and the confidence that we gained in ourselves and our ability to master problems. We had problems out the galore on almost every Gemini flight. Out of that kind of a background came the teams of people here and at the Cape, but I will speak to the teams here, the astronauts and the ground controllers in MCC, and we really felt confident in going into Apollo. Apollo 7 was successful, as you know. We tested the vehicle very well in Earth orbit, and then began the exciting phase of the moon project, where we began to test the really big hardware, that is the new rocket and the lunar module, and eventually made our assault on the moon in terms of completing the lunar landing mission with the team of people that we had built during those early years. And that team of people was just a crackerjack outfit. I have always been, and to this day, am overwhelmed with pride at the opportunity I had to be a part of that team. So with that, I'll turn it over to Joe and the rest of the guys to tell you, after we learned how to do things in Earth orbit, what we did to go to the moon.
Glenn, thank you. To take us out from Earth orbit, Cliff.
Yeah, I'd like to start, before I get into Apollo 8, go back to the thing Glenn mentioned about the second unmanned Saturn V launch. That flight occurred, I believe, in April of 68. I may have lost a year or two, but anyway, we had a few problems that day. We lost 2 engines during the second stage of the flight. We also had pogo, which nobody knew at the time because we didn't have real-time data on it, but we had pogo to the extent that the crew wouldn't have been able to read the cockpit gauges and would have probably required an abort. We had a number of other problems in the spacecraft, but we did stagger into orbit, and I say that is pretty an accurate description. We flew all over the sky, but we made it into orbit and finally got settled down a couple orbits later to do the S4B burn to drive the spacecraft up to come back in and simulate a lunar return, and lo and behold, it didn't light. So we aborted off of the S4B and burned the SPS engine some tremendous long period of time and got all we could out of the flight, but we didn't meet the objectives of the flight. So that as a background, a meeting occurred over at Marshall in the fall, and I knew there was a meeting, and I got a phone call one night early to come out to Kraft's office. He wanted to see me. Well, my first thought was, oh boy, we're going to fly another one of those unmanned deals with a boilerplate on it, and you're elected. That's what my thought was. So I walked into his office fully expecting that, and he looked at me and says, what do you think about taking Apollo 8 to the moon? And I said, well, I haven't thought about that. But on thinking about it for a little bit, it sounded like a fun thing to try to do. So he said, I want you to go get a certain group of people together, and we need to go get some answers. So we fanned out into a team and started looking at all the reasons why you couldn't and all the reasons why you could. And this had been going on for some time in the background. It was initiated by George Lowe and others. In any event, NASA made that decision, and while Glenn was preparing to fly Apollo 7, we had a small team off in the center, and many of you probably were on that team, trying to figure out how to do that, because we had to accelerate a number of things that we had not planned to do that early, primarily in the software world, some of the trajectory kinds of things. The spacecraft people had a heck of a job trying to go figure out whether they could stamp this hardware, which we hadn't even flown really, ready to go to the moon. Well, all that came together, and we did in fact make the commitment to go. As Glenn said, leading up to that, we had pretty well proved we knew how to get into Earth orbit and operate there, but this was the first time we were going to leave Earth orbit and go to a place that's 3 days away in terms of getting back if something happens. Not only that, we were going to do it without the lunar module, so we would wind up with one engine in lunar orbit to get us back home, which was eventually what we had to do anyway, but it was a little bit spooky if you sit and think about that for a while. The preparations were difficult. We spent a lot of hard hours working on that, but the day finally came, and we launched. The launch phase was fairly uneventful, as I recall, and we did our 2 orbits of preparation to get ready to go to the moon, and burned the S4B successfully for TLI. And from that point on, we had a different ballgame on our hands. For example, in Earth orbit, as most of you, or a lot of you know, you key everything that you're trying to do on the console, wherever your console is, to when is the next station pass. Because you got about 5 minutes to 7 minutes to get information up and down to the spacecraft. Well, here we were in a situation where we could talk to them anytime we want to. And that was a strange thing. As a matter of fact, I thought about that during the flight because I got to the point where you'd almost forget they were there because, you know, you could talk to them anytime you wanted to. But anyway, the trip out was not uneventful. And these guys, feel free to hop in here because you were involved too. one of the things that we had decided to do, clever devils that we are, was that we would test that engine on the way out to be sure that it worked right. And I think we were going to do a small out-of-plane maneuver just to burp the SPS and be sure it was working right. Well, we did that, and it didn't work right. And it did not. And there was a little funny in the thrust chamber pressure. So now we've got 3 days to look at the data and talk to everybody that you can find in the world to talk to satisfy ourselves that we can indeed commit to put this spacecraft in lunar orbit, knowing when we do that, it has to work to come home. Well, there are an awful lot of smart people today. Some of them are smarter than we were, I think, but there were some smart people then. And they gathered them, whether they be contractors at the bowels of a plant somewhere or the guy that designed it, whatever it took, and satisfied all levels of management at the Johnson Space Center and headquarters that yes, indeed, we understood what was going on with the engine. Today, I couldn't explain it, but that we were satisfied that it was okay to use it and commit to lunar orbit. Either you guys got anything to add to that? Some of you were involved in looking at that problem.
I would just add this to it, Cliff. In retrospect, that was a major systems problem that had to be dealt with and was dealt with right. And the situation we were faced with was there was the possibility that after the first burn, we could have done another little one and then another little one later to take it out, but we had to do those fairly quickly. So there was an urgency to deciding whether we would try another test on the engine or not, and it fell to me on my shift to deal with that problem. Well, at the same time, and I don't even know if this is public knowledge, but at the same time, there was a report from the crew that one of the crew members was ill. So this seemed to attract all of the high management's brains. Everybody that I thought I could get some help from, they were all off working on the fact that this guy got sick, which I didn't really care about because it wasn't a bloody thing that we could do about it that I knew of, so just be sick and be quiet about it, for God's sake. So,
I think he was. He didn't have much.
So anyway, while everybody else except the propulsion guys are over here worrying about this so-called sick astronaut, it fell to me to deal with this issue of, well, are we going to burn this thing another time and see if it works, and can we get it, and then do a burn after that to get us back on the trajectory we want, and we couldn't do too much because we were running out of fuel if we did too much of that fooling around, and if we're going to do anything, we had to do it in a big hurry. So after a whole bunch of deliberations with the people that Cliff talked about, I just took a deep breath, looked around one more time for the sick astronaut committee, and they were nowhere in sight, and said, well, you're right, it sounds all right to me, we're going to go ahead. And we didn't do any burns, and we set the track for the Apollo 8 mission. But boy, I sure felt like the Lone Ranger for quite a while there.
Well, I'll add something to that. It so happened that I was kind of riding shotgun on Apollo 8 and without a lot of detail to you, so I was put on that sick astronaut committee for you. But you got to, one thing to put in context here, we had never left the influence of Earth's gravity. And there was a worry amongst the sick astronaut committee that, my gosh, this means that there's something that we don't know about heading out of the Earth's influence, and it's caused this astronaut to get sick. Well, as most of you know, later on, we've had some of that almost on every flight. But it was a very serious concern, and here was poor old Glenn wrestling with all the technical stuff. But we did get finally solved, and in fact, the astronaut did fine a little later, which is the typical pattern once you get into orbit. Go ahead.
There's the advantage of being the lead flight director. You see, you just delegate all those tough ones to these other guys. In any event, having waded through all of that, we pressed on to the moon, and the next big milestone, of course, was the first lunar orbit insertion burn. And the long wait as they were behind the moon to find out what happened. Fortunately, everything went very well, but I was one worried individual the first time they went behind the moon. And I know Emil Scheitzer wouldn't agree with me, but it always spooked me to scale that 60 nautical mile orbit to the diameter of the moon and see how near that really is, and wanted to know whether you really figured that all out right. We did. They came around the moon in just about the orbit that we had predicted, and then they settled down to about 10 orbits, I believe, of extremely hard work. We really had some tired crewmen on our hands by the time they left lunar orbit. But we did that. We went ahead and made the burn to head for home. And there was a very relieved group of people, and I think Glenn Lundy was one of the most relieved when we came out from behind the moon, and indeed that engine had worked very well. I would point out that, as an aside, prior to going to the moon with the flights, we had budgeted quite a bit of propellant to do mid-course maneuvers because we didn't know how well we were going to be able to navigate, how well the systems were going to work. As it turned out, they worked very, very well, and we had programmed mid-course maneuvers, but they were very small, and in some cases we skipped them altogether. And as I recall, on 8, that's pretty well the situation we were in, both out and back, and here it's the first time we've done it. So that was very encouraging. We had some tired crewmen, as I said, coming back. They had elected to try to keep one man on watch at all times during that particular flight, and as we knew, we proved once again that you can't really do that because with the size of the cockpits, somebody awake keeps the other guys from sleeping very well. So they were pretty well beat by the time they got back to landing. Landing was uneventful, as I recall, and I would just summarize Apollo 8 in my mind. I think it was probably, as far as I'm concerned, the highlight of the Apollo program. The commitment, the decision that was made to take that step was fantastic in my mind. I don't believe you could make that decision these days. But to think that you're going to take the second spacecraft out of the chute, send it to the moon, and commit to that sort of endeavor it took a lot of courage on some people's part to do that. It was a great flight. One of the more thrilling things to me was the reading of the biblical passages when the guys were around the moon at Christmas time, which was something that they initiated. Nobody knew they were going to do it. But I can tell you this, there were some tears in people's eyes when that was going on. It was a great flight. I really enjoyed it. Anybody else want to add anything?
Cliff, thank you. Already I'm hearing stories I didn't know about before I flew in space. I'm glad I'm learning about them now. And Jerry.
Well, I'll kind of pick up where Cliff left there and step quickly and kind of bring maybe me and Steve up to the Apollo 11 time frame when we landed on the moon. And incidentally, I agree with what Cliff said. The Apollo 8 mission was kind of scary in a way, and the reason that it was kind of scary is that in the courage that he mentioned to take that step is that everything we had done up to that point, with the possible exception of the EVA that we did in Gemini, we had built a very careful building block approach, add one thing at a time and take the next step. And Apollo 8 kind of jumped out of that for a good reason. It pushed the system, I think, to go on faster and well within constraints of safety. But it showed an ability to take risk, and I think that's where, when it's measured and when the gain is worth the risk, and I think that's where Cliff and I really agree that those kinds of things are getting harder and harder to do. But let me get to that building block approach. Glenn kind of brought you through what built up to get us to Apollo 7. And for the most part, Apollo itself had that same building block approach. After 8, the next thing we did was Apollo 9, which was a low Earth orbit, back in Earth orbit again, but we added additional step to it. We added the lunar module. And the lunar module and the command module docked together just like it would be at the moon. We're in Earth orbit, and we undocked them and separated them. It's the first time we'd ever done anything like that, and had two people in the LEM, the lunar module, without a heat shield. It was the first time we'd ever had anybody in orbit that didn't have a protective heat shield to get down. And that was a significant step. But we also proved that we could rendezvous, redock, transfer the crew back in, discard the LEM, and re-enter the command module. Now that had to be done to return from the moon. So that was another step in the process. Apollo 10 came right after that. We had already been to the moon on Apollo 8 to go into orbit. Apollo 10 was another let's go into orbit around the moon, but it had the lunar module with it, which was another additional step. And we did the same thing in lunar orbit, something like we had done in Earth orbit on Apollo 9. We separated. The crewmen, Tom Stafford and Gene Cernan, went down very low to the surface but didn't land. But they were close. In fact, some of you may remember Gene Cernan saying we were really down amongst them, and that was because he could see the mountains higher, or at least appearing to be higher, like most airplane pilots think they're higher than they are, and they probably weren't. But they really got down low, and then they didn't abort and came up just like they would have had to in the event of an emergency. But this one was planned. It wasn't planned to touch down. So here we built another block. They came back up, rendezvoused with the command module. Command module did its maneuver and brought them home. So you can see this step by step creeping up on the problem. And by the time we launched Apollo 11, as Glenn said, the control team was ready. The launch people at Cape had been through it several times. The astronauts very well prepared. But there was a difference about 11. And I think some of us probably that were involved in it day to day, and I'd like to get the reaction of these guys, I don't think we felt the importance of it then like we did in later years. This was, and I get back to that building block process, it was another step on a goal we had been pursuing for so long that many of us didn't think of it, I don't think, as being this profound step. We saw it as a great achievement that we wanted to make happen, but we didn't understand maybe what the rest of the world, how they felt about it. And we started, I can remember, and I've thought about this a lot in the last week or two because I've had people ask me about it and reporters wanting to know what it was like. I can remember, and although on Apollo 11, I did a translunar shift, a sleep shift virtually on the way out and one on the way back because I was already assigned to Apollo 12 as the lead flight director and was already starting to think about that flight. But I can remember although we were on a high step and ready to do it, just like we had on 10, I didn't feel a great difference in the start. I didn't have a different feeling than I had from 10. And I took it kind of as one step. We've done this, we've been here, we keep going. And I can remember very clearly where the difference came. Now, Steve, for him, he'll probably talk about some of the alarms that we got on Apollo. Probably started there for him. It didn't for me because I knew he had that under control and it was a piece of cake. But what I really remember is when Buzz said, we're starting to pick up some dust. And I can remember to this day that I had the realization, he's talking about dust being blown off the moon by the descent engine. And that was a step we had not taken yet. And from there on, that flight had a great different feeling for me. And then, surprisingly, once we got off the moon and back up to the lunar orbit point, I felt, well, we've done this before, and it should be okay. But that interim period was that last step of that building block that we hadn't done yet, so it put that great difference to it. I think the mission control team's reaction to the landing is kind of understandable. While there was great euphoria, I think probably individually, there was no wild screaming or anything like that. In fact, Commandant Kranz was the flight director. And as those of you that know Gene Kranz, and those of you who don't, I'll tell you a little bit about him. Probably one of the toughest disciplinarian kinds of guys in the world, very extremely thorough, right on top of the situation. Gene Kranz was and is a national asset, and he was just the right guy to be running the control center that day. He kept a calmness to it. We had some abort opportunities planned there early. I think we called them T1 and T2, and we didn't know if when the limb touched down, it might start to, one of the gears might start to sink, and we might have to punch off immediately. But we did also have some windows pointed out where we would do these systems checks quickly, and if there was an opportunity to abort, we had the command module in the right space for him to get back to it. So it was a very business-like atmosphere, and kind of a calm sort of thing. On a personal note, as soon as we touched down and I realized we had done it, and it was all very exciting, I started thinking about Apollo 12. Actually, before they even had done their EVA, because we had already started talking about what we were going to try to do on Apollo 12, which was a pretty exacting test. And but that built on, and the control center throughout that entire period stay was a very subdued, professional kind of atmosphere. I can remember, and while I can't tell you exactly what it said, I can remember one humorous note that since I was kind of working the night shifts, I came in one night and one of our flight controllers had put up on one of the big screens about the size of this thing over here, some comment not too kind about the Russians. And other than that, I didn't see any frivolity in the control center throughout that whole period. Great opportunity and a great day for the country to think about now 20 years later. One final thought, and we were talking about this as we were standing up here before this started today. One of the things that just amazes me about that whole period leading up to the lunar landing, and even now to some degree, was the youthfulness of that control team. If I'm not mistaken, I think at that point, the man to my left here was in his mid-30s, and he was the oldest flight director. I won't pin it down to you. I think he was the oldest flight director, even older than Kranz. But we were all a bunch of young people. Steve Bales in his 20s. And when I think about marshaling that kind of energy and vigor and the interest that was shown, and we still see signs of that today, obviously. We did have a team of management on top of us, some of them older than that were very, very supportive and very visionary and very, very good. But I think back to the young people that made that happen, and kind of marvel that it could have been done by people so young. Glenn and I know have talked about this, we probably had more responsibility at about age 30 than most people will have in a lifetime. And we had that opportunity because NASA gave it to us. Joe?
Jerry, thank you. Steve, you're kind of the cleanup hitter, and feel free to correct what any of these old-timers have intended to say.
I had to correct them all the time when we were flying, I guess. Just continue on. I'm actually here representing Gene Kranz. Gene is on his way to Washington today, and I think I'd like to talk about two things, because he would want to talk to you about two things. One was Apollo 9. Jerry mentioned that. It was a very difficult mission, and Gene was the lead. Very difficult because it was sandwiched between probably the greatest mission of the Apollo program, Apollo 8. And if you didn't work on Apollo 8, I think you had heartache. I certainly didn't, and at 8.
Excuse me, I just can't let that go without commenting to the audience. You have to understand, Mr. Krantz, whatever flight he was working on was the toughest flight we ever flown.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And on the other side was Apollo 10, where we were going to take the two vehicles and go right down among them, as Jerry said. And here's Apollo 9, and it's going to stay in Earth orbit. And it's going to do things that are very, very important. We've never checked out the rendezvous systems. We've done rendezvous in Earth orbit. We've never used the systems, however, that we're actually going to use on the on the moon to get the two ships back together. And that was a mission that it took someone very special, I believe, to keep inspiring the team and keep them going and be just as excited about Apollo 9 as they would be about Apollo 10 and 11. And I think it's important that you all realize that between those two outstanding missions, there was Apollo 9, and it was just as essential as a building block to go on to 11 as the others were. The other thing I would like to do is take you back through Apollo 11, the landing and the activation, and then leave it on the moon, and then maybe turn it over to Glenn Lenny, who actually got them back off the moon, back up to the command module. We'd done a number of things in Apollo 8. Apollo 8 was very essential to us because we had a lot of unknowns about how we were going to navigate, not just the fact we were going to come so close to the moon, but we were really precisely having to put down a ship later when we were going to fly Apollo 11 within a few within less than a mile of a precise point on the moon we wanted to put it. And the moon is not a nice spherical place to navigate. It has concentrations all over. In fact, they call them mass cons for short. And they affected our orbit, and we weren't quite sure what techniques we were going to use to actually do the final targeting for the landing module. Apollo 8 taught us how to do that, and we actually were able to use those things on 11. The activation of 11 went so well because we had practiced it on 10. And the new thing, and a new part of the game, was the actual descent, as Jerry talked about. Now, go back to a personal moment. Before the final descent, and the crew was still on the back of the moon, the timeline ran, we would come around the side of the moon, we'd have 15 minutes to look at the spaceship, and then we were going to fire the engine, and we were going to land. 10 minutes before acquisition of signal, Gene Kranz gave a speech that General Patton would have liked to have given. And I can almost remember it chapter and verse. But the one point that will always stay in my mind is he says, I don't care how we do, we've trained, we know we're the best there is, and whatever happens, I'm going to stand behind you. And if you think that doesn't mean a lot to a group of flight controllers and a point like that, you just have never been in that situation. It really means everything to you. But then right after that, he says, I'm going to lock these doors. Now, I never was sure if he meant he was going to keep everybody else out or he was going to keep everybody else in, but he locked the doors. During the actual descent, there were at least five times when we could have stopped. And we were very lucky, I think. We were lucky, we were prepared, but in the end, we managed to make it through. Let me just go through the sequence a bit. We came around the side of the moon. We were expecting nice, clear communications, and every other piece of data was garbage. We had rough communications with a lot of noise. We couldn't hardly hear the crew, and the telemetry was there 1 minute and it wasn't there the next minute. And right away, Gene has to decide, do we have enough data to keep going on? Fortunately, that's what we'd been trained to do. The simulation people had driven us right to that point many times. And Gene pulled his flight control team, and collectively they tried to tell him, what we were seeing, what we weren't. He made a judgment that we had enough information to keep going on. We start the descent, and right away we find out we have another problem. Even though we'd done the very best we could on targeting, our ability to predict where the landing module was going to be was an error. It was an error at about 4 miles. The guys were coming in about 4 miles downrange from where they thought they were, from where we'd hoped we were targeting them. We find that out, and not only that, we have a velocity error in altitude, about 2/3 of the way to where we would have had to abort. We're sweating this one out for a couple of minutes, and during the descent, the way we set up 11, the crew actually rolled the vehicle around about 4 or 5 minutes into the descent. Landing radar locked on. Corrected the velocity problem. There wasn't anything we were going to do about the downrange problem. We're through that. We're starting to relax if you can call it that. And the crew says, I've got this computer alarm. There is no way you're supposed to be getting computer alarms during descent. There's absolutely no way you're supposed to. They're put in there to debug, check out, and do everything else, but they are not put in there that kind of alarm to have during descent. Fortunately, again, our training came to our aid. We had been given those kind of cases a couple of weeks before, and in fact, when we were given that case in the simulation, I was ready to write it off and say, what are we doing spending our time on this kind of nonsense? Because it's not realistic, and I've got other things to worry about. And Gene said, you will not write that off. You will form a team. You will get with the folks, and you will go through every possible alarm. I don't care if they're realistic or not. And you will make up a game plan on how you're going to play it. So due to the training and due to Gene's insistence, we had a game plan, and it was pretty good. Now, the experts in this case, this alarm happened to say, computers got too much to do in this last second. And the experts had been of some help, but not a great deal of help in this one. They said, look, this isn't supposed to happen. We talked about that for an hour. After we got them through that, after they told us for an hour it wasn't ever supposed to happen, and we said, finally got through to them that, yeah, but it has happened. What should we do? They said, well, it's a very bad situation. But if it doesn't happen too much, you're sort of left to come up with your own judgment about what you should do next. And our own judgment had been it wasn't happening that often, and everything else looked fine. Navigation looked fine, guidance looked fine, no more alarms, and we made the decision to go on. Now, the crew was distracted by the alarm so much that they were apparently, and at this time I didn't know this, they were looking inside the cockpit, and they were trying to figure out maybe it left a switch out of configuration, what have you. And by the time that Neil looked up and saw where we was going, this 4-mile error that I told you about had propagated. In fact, we weren't coming down in this nice, smooth place we were supposed to come down in. We're coming down to Boulder Field. And he is flying the ship as he'd been trained to do over the Boulder Field. All the time, the gas is getting lower and lower. And if you listen to the other ground, you hear this 60 seconds. That's what it really means, 60 seconds, and you're going to have to leave. And then you hear 30 seconds. And the same thing, and then there's a long pause even then. After the 30 seconds, we're getting down to the 17, 15 second frame. And most people don't realize that, I believe. We're about 15 seconds, give or take a couple, from having to stop the descent. And then the famous, I see the dust, crew touches down. And my personal reaction was one of intense relief and gratitude. And then it was one of wonder because the crew said something I'd never heard them say before. All during the training, they called themselves the Eagle. Never used any word but Eagle. And then on the day of January 20th at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they used the word Tranquility Base. And that changed the mission entirely for me because we really had a base on the moon, a forward outpost, if you will. And that was, to me, the most dramatic event and the most dramatic saying that was done during that mission. Now, we still had a lot of problems. We really didn't know where we were. I mean, clearly we knew within some diameter of where we were on the moon, but we'd landed downstream, didn't know where we were. We were going to have to find out before we took off the next day. And we left all those problems with Glenn Lunny, who had about 10 different sources to tell him where we were on the moon. I don't think any agreed, and he finally decided, and we kept going. So I'll turn that back to him.
Go ahead. This is right by the interstate, Steve.
Yeah, I recall once going to one of those change of shift press conferences, and I was having a terrible time trying to explain anybody that could figure out how to go to the moon and land didn't know where we were on the moon. But that was a situation for a while. Well, once Mr. Krantz and Mr. Bales and company and Mr. Armstrong and Aldrin got the machine on the surface, we set out to do something else that we hadn't done before. We had played around, I shouldn't use that word, we had done EVAs in Gemini, but of course that's under weightlessness environment. Here we're in 16G. So there were a lot of things that we needed to learn about that. How well can you move around, how fast can you move, and so forth and so on. And let me put in one story before I get into the surface activity itself. There had been a raging debate go on for months amongst the doctors and the rest of the world about when we land on the moon, what are we going to do next? That is, are we going to take a rest cycle with the crew, or are we going to go ahead and prepare to get out? Well, the doctors, in their judgment, felt that certainly we should have them go to sleep. There were a number of us who felt that that was going to be very difficult for anybody to do, having landed on the moon for the first time in the world, to immediately go to sleep. without some help. So anyway, the doctors won the debate, and it was baselined that we would, in fact, have a sleep period before we did the EVA. Now, they pointed out, several of them, Mr. Griffin has pointed out that I'm the elder of this group, and I was also clever enough to believe that they weren't going to do that when they got there. So we had prepared for that eventuality also, that if a decision was changed and they decided to go ahead and do the EVA, we'd be ready to support. Well, sure enough, not too long after they had landed and got all their switches taken care of and settled down a bit, we get this radio message that, Houston, we think we'd like to go ahead and do the EVA. And I'm smiling, you know, because I knew that was going to happen, and I'm needling the doctors. And, of course, we said yes. Well, the only thing in my mind that I did wrong was I had been up, like everybody else, for this whole preparation for descent and lunar descent. Now I had fixed myself where now I had to pull a whole shift on the moon. So it made for a long day. But anyhow, it took a while, being the first time we did it, and the limb was very cramped, to get all that gear on and checked out. And as I recall, it seemed like forever to get the cabin to finally depress to the point where they could open the hatch. That last 0.2 of a PSI or something, it seemed like it took forever. But Neil got out, and I recall my own reaction when he got out and onto the surface of the moon, and looking at it on that TV, I said, this just doesn't seem real, you know. And here I am sitting here in the middle of all this, and it just didn't seem real. But in fact it was. They set about to do their job, and as usual, we had over-programmed the timeline. We had put more stuff in there than 3 people could probably do. But they did the best they could. They also had to stop and take a phone call from somewhere down here in the White House area. And we had a carefully laid out plan that we were going to have, I believe there were 2 types of samples, documented samples, which took quite a bit of time, and what we call grab samples, where you just grab rock. Now, we only had about 2 hours and 30 minutes programmed to be out on the moon for this first flight. And again, we were playing it very conservatively. We could have stayed longer, but we felt, let's do what we have to do that is of significance, which was deploy a scientific package and gather some samples and get back in while we're ahead. So I think the guys did a fantastic job of doing the best job they could in a new environment, in a very compressed timeline, and with the distractions which were not of their doing. I still think they came out of it with really a wealth of information, and they really did a great job. The lunar surface thing, again, was entirely new to us. We'd spent many hours practicing. It's difficult to simulate that, but we could in some ways, and we even had practice astronauts that would get on the phone with us, and we'd play the what-if games on the moon, just like we would do in Rendezvous or any other operation. Again, we spent about 2 hours and 35 minutes, I believe it was. I was very, very relieved to see that cabin start pressurized, to get them back in there. At that point, I felt like we had done it, because I had complete confidence that we could, in fact, rendezvous with the mothership, and we had done those things before, and I was very confident that we had it made at that point. I was always very nervous when they were outside the spacecraft, in Earth orbit or on the moon, because when you stop and think that one seems like flimsy suit that you guys wear, and unluckily, as a flight director, I seemed to manage to have to terminate most of the EVAs in Gemini, so I was kind of nervous about that whole operation. So I was very glad when they got back in and pumped that cabin up. And you had 2 very, very tired astronauts at that point, and a heck of a lot of tired ones on the ground, too. And with that point, I think we did, in fact, manage to get them to sleep for a while, and Glenn's shift was to get them back to the command service module.
getting ready for ascent and lunar orbit rendezvous, there was one thing about ascent. It was there are no other alternatives. The ascent engine, the separation sequence from the descent stage, which represented sort of a platform from which to launch the ascent stage, was just one way. There was just one way to do it, and it had to work. For that reason, the ascent engine got a lot of attention, like a lot of other things did, but a lot of attention, and there was a great deal of worry about it, et cetera, in terms of getting off the moon. For me, and probably for the control center, for the flight controllers in the MCC, our job is kind of outlined by what decisions might we have to make. For example, during the launch phase, there's a possibility of all kinds of abort decisions or other kind of decisions have to be made, and it kind of loads you up with a set of possibilities, a set of options, a set of dealing with them. Countdowns are like that too. But for us, at least, and especially for me on the lunar surface, we didn't have any choices to make. We just had to get the thing all set up right, be sure all the navigation was right, and then go for it. There weren't any decisions to make. The thing had to work. And that's what happened. The ascent engine worked fine, and when we finished with it, we were in lunar orbit. At that time, I felt we were on the downhill side of the mission because this team of people here and the astronauts, we had done EVA every way from Sunday, not EVA, rendezvous, every way from Sunday during the Gemini program. We did them upside down, backwards, left-handed, right-handed, and we really felt like we knew how to do that. And besides that, we had Buzz Aldrin on board, who had invented the major part of the techniques that we used. So we were very confident about our ability to do the lunar orbit rendezvous. Apollo 10, of course, had added to that in the lunar environment. So getting through the ascent phase was just no choice, no decisions to make, just hang on to the console for 6 minutes and pray. And we did that. The lunar orbit rendezvous went well, and then the guys started transferring back into CSM for the eventual return back to this planet that we live on called Earth.
Thank you. We've gotten ourselves back into lunar orbit. Do you want to continue the mission, or do you want to start skipping around to other missions? Jerry.
Well, I think it's probably time to skip around a little bit. Understandably, we have focused on Apollo 11 because that's what we celebrate at this time. But I think what we did after 11, in a very summary way, can just say was nothing short of fantastic. We went back. As you know, one flight we aborted. And let me tell you about, in keeping with what Steve said about Gene Kranz, it was the mission that he was the lead on that was always the toughest. The really tough mission was Apollo 12. That's because I was the lead flight director on Apollo 12. And it was an interesting flight. And it's kind of an example of every one of these flights had every one of them we could sit and talk, particularly this crowd up here and some of you could talk about every one of these flights in great detail because they all had their own personality. Apollo 12 was the one you may remember we got hit by lightning about 50 seconds after launch.
With an Aggie flight director.
Yeah, Cliff says with an Aggie flight director. We handled that. I thought we were going to have to abort. Thank God the Saturn V kept working and got us into Earth orbit. It was a very interesting mission in that we went and did a pinpoint landing next to the Surveyor spacecraft, which had been sent up there unmanned 7 years earlier. And the crew of Conrad and Bean actually got out and got some pieces off of that spacecraft. And picking up on what Steve said, with our uncertainties about the moon's homogeneity, the idea that it's not a good sphere until you know all of where the mass cons are, and we weren't sure we could do it. Now, I was the lead flight director for that flight, and Cliff Charlesworth did the landing phase, and he's never forgiven me. We had a custom in those days when you were lead flight director the first time, you got the NASA Exceptional Service Medal. And I got my medal, and the salutation lauds me for performing the pinpoint landing that Clifford was the flight director for. And he's never forgiven me for it. one of these days I'm going to give you that medal,
Good.
just so you can have it. But anyhow, 13 turned out to be a real excitement because of the problem that we had with the oxygen tank blowing up. On the way to the moon, we had to abort. 14, 15, 16, all had their problems and their successes. And I think celebrating Apollo 11 like we are at this time is a great time to reflect on every one of those missions, because it's the only time that we can talk about the whole program and kind of celebrate it together, because we don't celebrate those other flights the way we did this one. But I think I just wanted to get that plug in there for those other missions that came after.
Thank you, Jerry. I'm going to jump in here for just a moment and say you've heard a lot from Cliff and from the others about the moral strength and courage that was required on the part of the flight directors and their team of literally hundreds of individuals, most of whom were very young, to make the decisions necessary to go to the moon and successfully carry it out. And I'll share a story with you that actually comes, it's a personal story, but it comes from that time. My son was 2 and 3 years old in those years, and one day he was discovered in the kitchen with a large box of dirt and pebbles from our backyard, which he had dumped on his mother's kitchen. And I inquired of 3-year-old son,